Okay, so we want to look at this one, and sorry that it's already solved for totally, but what we want to look at is we start with the home pivot point first, and that's at 1 comma 0, but we see that it's reflected across the y and the x-axis in this graph. And so one thing that we need to remember is do the transformations of this, and in order for us to do that, we need to factor out that negative. So this is what the transformation should look like after you factor out the negative. So we get that our new home pivot point is at -1, 0 since we reflected across the y. Well, now we have to recognize that we move up, or I'm sorry, right 4 and down 3 to get our pivot point at 3 comma -3. So the next thing, so we can go ahead and mark that on our graph. And the next thing we want to solve for is our asymptote. Well, with the log, we know that we're going to have a vertical asymptote, and we want it to make this inside equals 0. So what that's going to end up doing is we move it to the right 4, and you should see that that is where your vertical asymptote is. If you want to check that, press menu 7, plug in 4, and you should see an error if you plug in 4 for x. The next thing is what you will see whenever you graph this is it looks like the graph cuts off about right there. But in fact, we know that a range for a log function is always going to be -infinity to infinity. So it's going to have to keep going up. So please be sure to put that up arrow, or that will be wrong on that question for your quiz. Your domain, since it has a vertical asymptote of x equals 4, that's where we have a, that's where our domain restrictor is. So we have -infinity to 4. So that's what we can remember for that one. And then so for 12, we go ahead and we plug this into our calculator, and we get a graph that looks like this, right? So we want to state the pivot point, and we want to factor this out, so we get -3 to x plus 3 in parentheses plus 1. So we know that our home pivot point for an exponential is 0, 1. And we realize that after the transformation, that our pivot point is going to, our final pivot point is going to be at -3, because we want to make that exponential to negative. And due to the fact that we reflected across the x-axis, now this is going to be 0. So that's your pivot point. So we can go ahead and graph that. We want a horizontal asymptote, and we can get that by finding where we plug in something to make the numerator, or I'm sorry, to that degree 0. And so we end up seeing that our horizontal asymptote is at y is equal to 1. For our domain of a exponential, we know that our domain is always -infinity to infinity. And for our range of an exponential, we end up getting that it is -infinity to 1. And our graph should look something like this. So then we flip it over to the back, and we start doing these graphs. And so basically I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker since we've already seen 2 of them. But we see by doing the same process, we have a pivot point, at -1, 5, and we get that from our transformations, knowing that our base is at 0, 1. So we go ahead and graph that. So -1, 5. Okay, we know that we have a vertical asymptote at x equals 4. So vertical asymptote at x equals 4. We have a domain then of -infinity, 4, and a range from -infinity to infinity. And our graph then I'm sorry, our asymptote should be a horizontal asymptote, so it should be y is equal to 4. So this should be our asymptote. I'm sorry, this is an exponential graph, not a log. I was treating this as a log. So our range is going to be, our domain is going to be -infinity to infinity, and our range is going to be 4, infinity. My apologies for that. So whenever we graph this, it should look like something like that. So my apologies for that, but we need to remember, and that's a good thing to remember for everybody, is if we don't see log or natural log in the equation, then that's how we know that we need to treat it as an exponential. And I didn't, for whatever reason, I was treating this as a log, which is why I was getting confused. So then we go to our last one, number 14, and we see that it's reflected across the x, and we have a we shift to the left 4. I'm sorry, to the right 4. So whenever we do that, we have a pivot point. Shifting our base pivot point to the right 4 gives me 5, 0. So we can graph that. We have a asymptote at x equals 4. And we have that our graph should look something like this. So that means our domain is 4, infinity, and our range is -infinity to infinity. And so again, for the transformations, we just really want to be able to tell us if it goes left or right, just our vertical and horizontal transformations for each of those. So I imagine we'll go over one of these before the quiz within that 30-minute time frame that we have to study, but that is how we want to approach the graphing questions.